How widespread is debanking in the crypto space?
To say this is pervasive is an understatement. It became so commonplace to us that it became background noise. And we started thinking about it. It was just assumed that if you were a crypto company, you would have trouble getting banking services.
Unbelievable.
The Senate Banking Committee putting some of the nation's biggest financial institutions on watch today, led by Chair Tim Scott. The hearings on debanking looking to highlight discriminatory practices in the sector, especially when it means pulling the plug on conservatives. The big divide, who is to blame? Republicans largely focusing on overregulation, while Democrats pointed to the biggest banks themselves.
Joining us now is senior counsel at Alliance Defending Freedom, Jeremy Tedesco, along with one of the witnesses from today's hearing, partner at Davis Wright Tremaine, Stephen Gannon. Gentlemen, great to see both of you. I'm really familiar with Operation Choke Point that went after, say, firearms dealers and pawn shops and payday lenders where the Obama administration cut off banking access. But, Stephen, who is responsible for targeting, say, just people in the crypto space? Because Mark Andreessen knew at least 30 founders who were intentionally targeted and debanked on purpose. And it seemed to be a targeted campaign that came right out of the Biden administration.
Dagan, I think the best way to think about this is Operation Choke Point 1.0 was Chapter 1. Operation Choke Point 2.0 was Chapter 2. In Chapter 1, you had 30 different, if you remember this, 30 different businesses that were listed by the banking regulators and by DOJ as their targets. Crypto just happened to be 31. And it has been pervasive. In fact, my fellow witness, Nathan McCauley, indicated that he was at a gathering of crypto executives in San Francisco. And he asked, just kind of for grins, how many of you have been debanked? There were 100 people in the room. 100 hands went up. So it's not something that's a figment of anybody's imagination. No. It has been pervasive, and it has been driven by regulatory policy, which I addressed in my testimony, and I'll be happy to talk more about it tonight.
Well, Jeremy, there was a confluence, almost a perfect storm between not only the woke activists at the banks, but there was also woke regulators at the Fed. The people who were watching the banks were also from the same kind of place, the same kind of ideology, if you will. And they kind of worked together in the past 4 years, didn't they? To whether it was 1.0 or 2.0 of Choke Point, they were working together. It was a perfect storm, no?
Well, you're completely right. The regulators certainly bear responsibility, but the banks do as well. I mean, we know that banks have very vague policies dealing with terms like reputation risk or hate or intolerance. And these are the kind of terms that can easily be weaponized against banking customers. They can also be exploited and abused by government regulators and even outside groups that are trying to weaponize the financial industry against their political opponents. But we've seen this with our own client, Indigenous Advance Ministries, does relief work in Uganda for hurting widows and orphans, had an account at Bank of America for 8 years, and then out of the blue received the notice that they were no longer going to be banked there because their risk profile had exceeded the bank's risk tolerance policies.
Right.
And the banks always hide behind the regulators, and it's really hard to tell. Is it the regulators? Right. Is it the bank? My guess is a combination of all of them, including those outside activists that you're talking about.
But, Stephen, I want to you mentioned regulations, but I want to get back to, in a simple question, who ordered the code red? Because somebody had to, it is ultimately individuals who are responsible for, at the regulators, responsible for running the show.
It's, Dagan, I would like to correct one thing that my colleague just said. Reputation risk is not a term that originated with the banks. Reputation risk is a term that came into being as the CAMELS ratings, which are the ratings for safety and soundness of banks, began to be developed in the mid-1990s. Mm-hmm. It's a very malleable term. It can mean almost anything, but banks unfortunately have to deal with it. And there is an answer as to who sort of pulled the alarm and ordered the code red. You can go back to late 2021, and you can see that the banking agencies began to issue interpretive letters that essentially set themselves up as gatekeepers. And what those interpretive letters said is even if you as a bank were engaged in permissible crypto activities, that you nonetheless had to go to those regulators and get what's called a supervisory non-objection. That's extraordinary. That's never been done before in the absence of some sort of consent order or the like. The regulators set themselves up as gatekeepers, and unfortunately, the gate never opened.
Wow.
Jeremy Tedesco and Stephen Gannon, we're going to continue to follow this because it's not just crypto.
Yep.
We know that. Thank you, gentlemen, so much.